In a new survey, 94% of LGBTQ youth report that recent politics have negatively impacted their mental health. That is according to the Trevor Project. In the past year, half of all LGBTQ youth of color, including 67% of black respondents, reported facing discrimination based on their race or ethnicity. A book titled All Boys Aren't Blue, a memoir manifesto, explores growing up while being both black and queer. It tackles heavy topics including gender identity, discrimination, and consent. And here with us now is author George M. Johnson. George is a journalist and HIV and LGBTQ activist. Thank you for joining us. So there have been many, books about the journey of coming out, but the thing about your book, George, is that you wrote it for young adults, and it's using the language that young adults can really understand. And I think also the other interesting thing, and part of the reason why so many people are drawn to your book, is that this is not a story of, a kid that was kicked out of his home. You come from a very loving, extended family, but it's also, you're not being raised now, so there are still, there's language and all sorts of things that people have to tackle that maybe we're a little more sophisticated these days, but you address all of that. I want to ask you why it was really important to write your story, but also write your story for young adults.
Yeah, good morning, and thank you for having me on. I was a journalist for several years, and as a journalist, I had written my story in bits and pieces over the past decade. We had got to 2017, and there was a really tragic case of a young man by the name of Giovanni Melton, who was killed by his father. And one of the quotes that came out was that his father had stated that I would rather have a dead son than a gay son. That was realistically the catalyst that let me know that I had to put my story out there, and that I had to put a story out there that showed what you could become and who you could become when you came from a home that was loving and affirming. I grew up not too far from where I live now. I'm in Newark, New Jersey. I grew up in a small city called Plainfield, New Jersey, where my mom and my grandmother knew since the age of about 2 that I was going to be queer. They didn't know exactly how it was going to turn out, but they knew that my family had already experienced this before because I grew up with a transgender cousin named Hope, who I talk about. But I felt it was important that people understood what the mentality was for a young Black queer kid to be going through the intersections of race and gender identity. And I wanted young adults to know that when they were going through those same processes as I was in my head, questioning everything and not sure of who I was or what was really going on, that if they are feeling that way now, it's valid and it has precedent, that I am not the first person to ever have this story. I just say I'm the first person that gets to tell the story of all of our ancestors and transcestors who came before us, who had this very same struggle and identity crisis. And so that was why I specifically wanted it for young adults, because I wanted them to feel seen in a way that I never got to feel seen growing up.
That is such a striking statement, and I'm sure that this book and what you're saying now and what you have been saying and speaking about is going to transform lives. Not everyone, though, is as fortunate to grow up with a queer affirming family, and you acknowledge that in your book. And what I think about is people that came before you and did not have someone like you or a book like yours to look to. And I don't even mean people who were sort of nameless and faceless across this country. Some of our literary heroes, like James Baldwin. I mean, I can't imagine what it would be like growing up in that stifling, crushing world where you cannot be who you want to be authentically, because if you are, then you are smacked down and you may not even have a livelihood. I mean, but there is a complicated relationship between queerness and the Black community, and it's often negative. Talk to us about that and how you see folks overcoming that.
Yeah, it's really, really tough. I'm always having to explain to everyone that we have been colonized. We were colonized, and that homophobia, misogyny, a lot of the isms and the phobias we deal with in the Black community came through colonization, from them trying to get us to assimilate into the hierarchy and the structures of white community. We've also been indoctrinated with Christianity, which in many ways calls us the abomination, and so there's a tie-in there. And there's just a lot of myths and beliefs around how people who are Black and queer, that we are ruining the Black family dynamic. I'm always trying to showcase what my life looks like in totality to push back against a lot of those narratives. I am spiritual. I did grow up in the church. My grandmother, she was one of the first people I've ever seen push back against people who were within the church. She always challenged their notion of, why do you tell, people they can come as they are, and just so you can condemn them? Why do you tell people that we are all a reflection of God, and then try to tell these certain individuals that they aren't part of that reflection? She was very adamant that I could be a part of the LGBTQ community and that I could have salvation. And so I think just growing up in that way and watching that there are some people who fully understand that we are not an abomination, and that we are not something that isn't part of Blackness, something that isn't part of the totality of community, is really, really important in pushing back against a lot of those stigmas. It takes more of us to realize that we all grow up with queer people in our lives, even if those people don't acknowledge that they are queer. And realizing that so many people, as you were stating before, James Baldwin, but I can even talk about Langston Hughes. Langston Hughes lived his entire life closeted. And, you have so many other pioneers who we are only taught the one aspect of them, only taught about their accomplishments, but never talked about what their gender identity was. And the fact that lens is how they saw the world, and why it's important to know that they saw the world through that lens. And so I'm always pushing for Black community to just have conversations. I think that's the biggest issue, is that we don't have enough conversations about what it is like to be Black and to be queer, or to be Black and to be woman, or to be Black and to be man, because all of those intersections matter. And as I always say, you can't have a Blackness without queerness. This dates back to ancient Africa. Queer people who were Black have always existed. And I think if we start to reteach our community that we have always been here, and start to unlearn the notion that that being Black and queer is something new, I think we can really start to push past a lot of those hurdles and boundaries that our community has unfortunately been assimilated into.
Man, I think that what you said there is so powerful. And as you were talking, I was just thinking about kind of the social media pushback that you see sometimes when maybe like Dwayne Wade dresses, similar to he has a trans child, as a way of supporting his child, and people will push back. Or when Will Smith's son did that kind of fashion shoot, he was wearing a dress or a kilt or something like that, and then all these people push, what are you doing to the Black family? They're systematically pulling apart the Black family. And it totally ignores the fact that the Black family includes queer people and all kinds of other people, as if it's some sort of outside force working against this unit, when that's just not the case. So I think that's really important for people to hear. You said in your book that you actually wish that you would come out sooner. Tell me about your decision to come out when you did, and the stigmas that you were concerned about.
Yeah, I went to Catholic school. So going to Catholic school
Me too.
1999 and 2003. And I often think about it. I'm like, wow, had I identified as queer then and tried to even go to the prom with a boy, I probably would have been kicked out of school. Because there were cases back then, and I remember there were cases of kids who were trying to push that and were kicked out of school. My decision to finally, and I'm also going to say I hate the term coming out. I think it doesn't really center us. So one of the things that I teach queer youth is that they're not coming out, that they're actually inviting in. And so, people are assuming that you are one way. And so when you decide to tell people who you truly are, it's not really coming out, you're actually inviting them in. And I think that coming from that space of having agency to say who gets to come in is really, really important for queer youth. So I'll say that when I decided that I wanted to invite people into who I was, it was a decision of where I had to choose my happiness over everything else. And at the time, I just wasn't happy. I was unhappy living almost two separate lives where my family, in many ways, and certain friends only got to see one aspect of me. And then I had a whole other community that I would hang out with, participate with at Pride. And I knew that I could not exist as these two beings for much longer. And so that was the catalyst for me to invite everyone in because I wanted my life to look whole. I didn't want to have to live as two separate beings any longer. And I think a lot of Black queer people still have to live at the intersection of almost trying to perform as two different people until they are able to come to a place of confidence where they invite people in. Unfortunately, safety is the main concern at all times for us. And so we just have not felt safe enough. There are many adults who still have not felt safe enough to share their truth. And so I think that's realistically what was the catalyst for me to begin inviting people into who I was, in the hopes that more people would see me publicly living my life to in turn help them push past those boundaries as well.
So George, right before we let you go, because All Boys Aren't Blue is for young adults, I want to ask you a question. Earlier in the day, we ran a segment with an interview with a trans boy who was fighting. He had a lawsuit. He's fighting some of these anti-trans laws that are being passed, in particular one that would stop any sort of medical assistance for young trans people. And he said that he did not have the words, because he was a young person, he did not have the words for the way that he felt inside. But one day he held the door open for someone, and the person said, "Well, thank you, sir." And he was like, "Oh yeah, that feels right." I'm wondering if in the book, or if not in the book, there was a moment for you where you were too young to have the words, but something happened and you said, "Oh yeah, that feels right. That's who I'm supposed to be."
Yeah, I think what I could say is my cousin Hope, I talk about it in the book. I grew up with a transgender cousin named Hope. And I guess for a while, I didn't necessarily feel seen because I didn't know what was going on or who I was. But we had a moment together at a cookout. And I just remember her, she was doing her makeup and I was walking past the bathroom and she was like, "Hey, how you doing today?" They call me by my middle name, Matt. She was like, "How you doing today, Matt?" And I'm doing good. And I was like, "Oh, I see you putting your makeup on." And she turned to me and she said, "Yes, Matt, and you're always gonna have to remember that cover girl doesn't cover boy." And it was like a moment where we laughed, but it was the first time that I realized, oh, she knows. Okay. And because that would be the only reason she would say something like that to me. And then from that moment, that led to us at every cookout, I was the one who would take her to the store to get cigarettes. And that's when we would just have talks. And they weren't talks about my identity, but they were just talks that she knew I just needed someone that could understand what I was dealing with and what I was going through. And so, yeah, that was really the first time that I can remember feeling seen by someone.
What a fascinating journey. Thank you, George, for everything and for the book. And I love the poster behind you there, "Writing is my superpower, we are not broken, words to live by." George M. Johnson, thank you very much.
Thank you all for having me.